Hello, everyone. I am Kenny Coogan, and I am the Education Coordinator for the Center for Inquiry. And one of our programs is the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science. And we are excited to have author and zoology correspondent Jules Howard with us. Thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar live. If you have questions for Jules, you can type them into the chat box below, and I will read them to him at the end. And with that, welcome, Jules. It's early morning in Florida, but you're already in the evening where you are, correct?
It is. Well, it's actually like mid-afternoon, but it's so dark and damp and rainy here, like it might as well be the middle of the night, to be honest. So yeah, no, thank you ever so much for having me, guys. And it's such a pleasure to talk about evolution. It's such a pleasure to talk about eggs, I suppose, and the sort of secret role that they've had in evolution. So I reckon this talk will be about half an hour. And I wanted to sort of talk about some of the aspects that kind of surprised me as a writer. And I've written about zoology and the science of animals for like 20 years, but there was so much right in this book that I was really surprised at. And there's so many things that I'm like, oh my gosh, I keep thinking about even now. So it's a real pleasure to talk about some of these things with you. I've organized it like this. I'm going to talk about like 5 things from researching the book that really, really amazed me about nature and about animals and about evolution more generally. So yeah, 5 bits, and then I'd love to hear your questions. It's like the best bit of my job really is hearing people's questions and allowing a bit of discussion, I suppose. Yeah, I find that really energizing. So yeah, the book is called Infinite Life. It is a kind of retelling of the evolution of animals from the perspective of eggs. Okay, so that sounds kind of weird. Like eggs are very sort of still, solitary, quite boring structures. But in fact, like if you think about it, like, eggs adapt and they change and they evolve and they sort of suit their habitats and their world in exactly the same way that animal bodies do. So I wanted to explore that and kind of, instead of thinking of animals as the organisms that walk around and, on land or in the sea, producing eggs, I wanted to sort of view animals as basically vessels for making eggs. So, eggs use animals as a way to multiply in the same way as we imagine animals or any organism on this planet. So it's a kind of retelling, a reshaping, a reviewing, I suppose, of evolution. It was so fun to write. I was brought up on these kind of Richard Dawkins and people like that, and this idea of, fish moving onto the land and, their fin bones evolving into these structures that we call fingers. And we see these in bony land animals. And I really love that story. And it's been really cool to kind of tell that story from a different angle, I suppose. So eggs, right. Let's see. Why eggs? For me, when I was about 10, I don't know if this is something you guys do in the US, but we used to in our, I suppose, what would be elementary schools, our version of an elementary. We would have some teachers would bring in frog spawn. They would bring it in a little tank, a little aquarium, and we would have, like most classrooms in the UK would have a blob of frog spawn. And most kids, weren't that interested. It was just a smelly, blob in the corner. But I was one of a kind of clutch of people that just absolutely became quietly obsessed with what was going on. It was like an alien thing that, what I mean? It just appeared in the classroom overnight. And I just loved it. I'd never seen anything like it. I live in quite a built up sort of urban place. And it was really cool to see this really wild thing, I suppose. So that kind of was like my gateway drug into eggs. And it was from there that I really got excited by eggs. One of the cool things about eggs is they're really accessible. So, if you wanted to study, I don't know, cheetahs, or if there's any young zoologist watching this that's like, I want to study hippos or sharks, they're actually really, it's like a lot of skill to study. A lot of training to get to the right place at the right time and to do it safely. Eggs aren't like that at all. Like eggs are actually quite easy to study because as long as you look after them and treat them well, they're not going to go anywhere. So you can study them in lots and lots of detail. So for that reason, I kind of felt like I could perhaps tell a really good story about eggs that hadn't been told before. So I mentioned some surprising facts. For me, in this talk, I know a lot of you might be thinking, okay, we're going to be talking a lot about birds' eggs. But of course, bird eggs are just one category, one group of what is a thing that is found across the animal kingdom. So it's not just bird eggs, there's all sorts of amazing eggs out there. But I suppose the most accessible egg is the chicken's egg, right? This is something we see fairly often in our daily lives, depending on your sort of dietary habits. But you know, this really common thing, we don't think much about eggs, but like they're absolutely just exquisite. You can see on this picture here all sorts of little freckles, all sorts of little kind of bumps and bubbles. You know, these things we hold in our hands, you know, they have more than 10,000 holes in them, tiny microscopic holes that allow carbon dioxide from the embryo to escape into the atmosphere, and then they allow oxygen in, which the embryo of course uses to you know to breathe and sustain itself. So these are kind of breathing, living entities. And the eggshell, you know, is it's just where it gets a little bit crazy. And I know I sound a bit like I'm having some sort of fever dream, but actually, when you think of, you know, eggshell as a structure, that is something that's laid down deep inside the animal body. So with a chicken's egg, you know, it actually starts off without that shell. It starts off like a ball of jelly, I suppose, deep inside the mother chicken. And as the jelly egg moves down the chicken's egg tube, it's basically like a car going through a car wash. It's being sort of sprayed by all these different kinds of chemicals. So starts off like a blob of jelly, moves through these nozzles, these spray jet guns, essentially deep inside the chicken, and they spray on this hard, frothy, kind of calcium-rich, chalky, bubbly froth, you know? And that froth, that liquid, it sort of sets, it crystallizes. And as it moves through the egg tube, it becomes hardened and it becomes more shapely. It becomes like more of a classic egg shape. So, like, sounds so weird, a bit disgusting, a bit icky to think about it. But actually, the eggs we hold in our hands, you know, they've been constructed deep inside, you know, a bird. And as we know, birds are, you know, modern day descendants of dinosaurs. So these are sort of dinosaur structures we have in our lives. I love it. It's amazing. So yeah, the freckles I mentioned, the little dots and markings that you see on a bird, particularly chicken eggshells. Again, these are produced by tiny little nozzles. You know, it's a bit like a paint gun. You know, there are little paint guns inside the female chicken's egg tube, and these spray these identifying markers on. And in fact, we see these markings in all sorts of bird shells. You get these lovely little lines. Sometimes you get blotches. Of course, you get colors. Each one looks like its own kind of constellation, I suppose. And in fact, you can actually, it's a bit like a fingerprint. You could work out which bird produces which egg just by looking at the markings. And each of these markings, you know, they're made by, like I say, an egg tube. So any hard-shelled egg is made by an egg tube in nature, whether you're a mosquito, whether you're a turtle, whether you're a chicken, whether you're a dinosaur. These long egg tubes are like I said, the car wash. They're the things that make these beautiful, I think, patterns. And like for like 150 years, scientists have been arguing about like what on earth these markings mean. You know, birds go to it. It takes a lot of energy to make these markings on eggs, so there must be a purpose. For 150 years, you know, scientists argued about what that purpose was. Was it for camouflage? Was it to protect eggs from radiation from the sun? You know, what's the cause of this adaptation? And in fact, the last 30 years, there's been like a hypothesis, there's been like an idea, a new idea for what's going on here. And that is that birds, you know, let's say, let's pick out one of these eggs here. So guillemot egg. Okay, in fact, let's go for this. I think it's an emu egg, this turquoise egg, this green egg that's basically in the center. So those markings are produced, as I said, by the female bird that laid them. And they lay their egg, and the first thing they do, in fact, nearly all birds do this, is they look at their own egg and they scan the pattern with their eyes. So they make a like mental note, dot, dot, dot. like a star chart. They make that in their head. Now, if another bird comes along and lays an egg in their nest, the adult bird that laid the first egg will look at the new egg and think, hang on, I don't recognize that. I do not recognize that egg at all. And that's the egg that that mother might kick out and, destroy essentially. So we find with a lot of birds, it's a really simple strategy to try and lay your eggs in other nests. And this seems to be a kind of a locking mechanism, a kind of identification mechanism, I suppose, to stop that from happening. Some birds are really good at it. As you can see, these are all examples of birds that are regularly targeted by cuckoos. And cuckoos, of course, are really good at laying their eggs in other nests. So we see this beautiful arms race between the host, who is the one laying the eggs, and the parasite, which is the cuckoo, which is trying to lay those eggs in there. And, I mentioned before about having written about evolution for like a long, long time. I love the fact that this has not been, designed. This is a completely automatic process, if you like, but it happens to have produced something that is, we think, obviously really, really beautiful. And these colors are, like I say, they're just exquisite. But I don't want you thinking that eggs are just a bird thing. Clearly, they are not. These are the eggs of different species of stick insect. And stick insects, a bit like birds, make all sorts of really unusual shapes for their eggs. Each species has its own unique shape, and this isn't caused by parasitism. It's not caused by like cuckoo versions of stick insects. This is because each stick insect chooses a different species of ant to look after its egg. So these eggs, it's crazy. These eggs are covered in special scents, like odors, stinks, in other words, that smell like different ant colonies. And if you're a stick insect, you produce your egg, you drop it on the floor, and the smell of your egg, the ants come and collect it, and they say, let's look after this wonderful thing. They think most people think it's because they think it's a seed from a plant. So they carry the seed back to their nest and like, wow, the stick insect has a place, a safe place for its egg and for its babies to kind of grow. So these are mimics of seeds. That's why they all look different. It's because in every different part of the US or wherever you are, stick insects have got different seeds on the floor that their eggs are adapting towards, like mimicking. So again, like, eggs, it's really easy to think of eggs as kind of boring. They just sit there, animals pop out of them. But actually, eggs adapt in all sorts of unique and amazing, and I think really beautiful ways. So that was one of the things that I loved. That was, the surprising fact number one is like eggs are incredibly varied. They're as varied and unusual as the animals that kind of hatch out from them. So yeah, surprising fact number two is eggs are not a recent thing at all in evolutionary history. They didn't just start with dinosaurs. They didn't just start with fish. In fact, eggs go incredibly far back in the kind of evolutionary story, if you like, of life on Earth. So this is a fossil. It's about the size of a grain of sand. And this fossil was found in a really interesting fossil formation in China. It's over 500 million years old. So this comes from a time before there are animals as you and I know them, before the so-called Cambrian explosion, when loads of different animal forms kind of took shape. This comes from a time before that, and you can see it's got these are actually incredibly fossilized cells. So this was an egg, and the shell of it has sort of been exposed, opened up, and you can see the dividing cells within it, which is just absolutely marvelous. It's just so good. So we find fossil structures like these. Some of them have 2 cells, some of them have 4 cells, some of them have 8 cells. That is, I suppose, one bit of evidence that suggests, these really were developing embryos. Now, what were they from? 500 million year old eggs. What on earth were they from? Most scientists think they're from jellyfish-like animals, or maybe sea urchin-like animals, so a bit like starfish. But the truth is, scientists are still trying to kind of work that out. Work out what kinds of life forms were hatching out of these things. But to find them, the scientists that study these things, they're the most patient scientists I've ever come across. So they're basically studying grains of sand on a microscope slide. That's their version of like paleontology. So much patience required. So yeah, eggs go back a really, really long way in history. And in fact, we talk about, another animal thing is very much, sperm and eggs. Just looking at the DNA coding, if you like, for sperm production, the fact that all modern day animals, whether you're a jellyfish or a hippo or a human, have those same genes for producing sperm, we think that sperm and eggs will go back right to when we all shared the same ancestors, because we've all got those same DNA codes. We've all got them, inherited them from the same place. So we think that might even be 700 million years ago, maybe 800 million years ago, that, eggs were becoming a thing for the animal kingdom. So yeah, eggs. I know perhaps there's one or two of you thinking like, I'm going to ask him at the end, chicken or egg, like which came first? I'm going to say egg. Just looking at the wonderful bits of fossil evidence from China, I'm like, oh my gosh, eggs go back so far. They're beautiful. So, okay, there's some more nice little pictures of eggs for you, little fossil eggs, again from this really early time period. So yeah, eggs are beautiful. Yes, eggs go back really far in evolutionary history. I honestly think, for my third surprising fact, I think I think about this all the time. I come back to it all the time in my head. Is eggs are kind of shaped as much by everyday life, but they're also shaped by dramatic world events, the moving of continents, big rocks from space, meteorites from space that explode and destroy pretty much most life forms on this planet. Like eggs really are sort of shaped by those global events. And the story in the book that I think about a lot still actually is what was going on in the Carboniferous. The Carboniferous was like a really big time for like shaping eggs. So the Carboniferous, long before dinosaurs, Carboniferous is when there's lots of humid plants growing. Of course, much of the coal that we dig up around the world, these are seams of coal laid down 300 million years ago or more. They basically squashed up swamp bog plants essentially. So yeah, that was a really humid, a very rich time, very productive time in Earth's history. Like I say, long before dinosaurs, most animals on Earth were kind of simple land fish like animals, I would say. So they're almost like amphibians, very reptile like, you could say, very simple salamander or newty kind of animals, I guess you could say. So back then in the Carboniferous, at the start of the Carboniferous, it's incredibly hot. It's really humid. By the end of the Carboniferous period, it actually gets really warm. It gets much drier. And over that period, the Carboniferous period starts off wet, ends up dry. And in that long, say 50 million years or so, we see as the world becomes drier, mostly because continents are moving around and sort of reconstructing themselves on Earth's surface, which changes the climate loads. What we notice as the Earth gets drier is you start to see the evolution of eggs that are incredibly tough. So you're talking about weatherproof eggs that are basically dressing themselves in like a bit like, I'm really addicted to this show on Apple TV called it's about like basically it's about space, and every time I see an astronaut putting on their suit, I'm like, yeah, that's a little bit like what happened to eggs, right? You've got a very hostile environment. Planet Earth's drying up. It's getting drier and drier. Eggs find that incredibly tough because, of course, they lose water in dry places. So we start to see the evolution of a kind of like a bit like an astronaut's costume over the shell of the egg. Gets tougher and tougher, and it can withstand more and more. And we see that in those land fish. So these are the four-legged organisms that are walking around on land. We see the evolution of tough eggs in them, but we also see it in insects. Around the same time, the Earth's changing, continents are fusing, the climate is drying and becoming much hotter. And in two separate, unrelated groups of animals, we see the same evolutionary endeavor, the same kind of evolutionary adventure, I suppose, when it comes to eggs. So let me show you what happens to insects. These are the eggs of shield bugs. So these are really, really common bugs. I'm sure many of you guys have seen them. You might even have flicked one off your shoulder over the summer that we've just had. So their eggs are often found on the undersides of leaves, and they're like a classic insect egg. And I mean, I mentioned about astronauts before. It's like, look at that. It looks like it belongs in a science fiction film. Uh, this sort of metallic sheen is partly because of a structure that insect eggs evolved called the serosa. And I've read and written a lot about insects over the years, and nobody ever mentions the serosa. It's actually one of the most important things that ever happened to insects. So the evolution of this armored waterproof blanket, essentially inside the egg, the evolution of this blanket meant that eggs could be much more hard wearing. It meant that water stays in the egg to support the embryo without evaporating into the atmosphere. So it really is like a space suit in its own sort of weird and wonderful way. But also, I want to draw your attention to the way that insect eggs hatch. So they have a little line across the top, like a circular bit on the top of the egg that detaches really easily. So when the baby insect starts to squirm, it just lifts off a little bit. Like, it don't want to keep going on about the astronaut thing, but it really does lift off like the lid of like a Mars rover or something like that. And then the insect alien just like crawls out. But yeah, a very, very important structure in the history of insects. And we live in a world of insects today. This is an insect planet. We just so happen to live on it. More than 1 million different kinds of species, perhaps 5 million undiscovered insects that, people in younger generations, you will be the people to discover those in future. But yeah, insects are everywhere. And I argue in the book, and I stand by it, the reason insects are so successful is probably because most of them can fly, but also because they can fly from place to place and drop these amazingly resilient structures. So yeah, insect eggs, they are the products of a drying world in the Carboniferous period all those years ago. But also, the same was happening in early reptiles as well. So reptiles, as you know, nowadays we think of things like, crocodiles and lizards and geckos and dinosaurs, of course. But actually, in this very early age, this is the Permian. This is like kind of before dinosaurs. We see the same kind of egg structure evolve. Now, this picture just looks like a sort of mash, squashed up mash of bones. But it's actually a little beautiful fossil. It's about double the size. It's about the size of a baseball. Okay, so that's like my nice American reference for you guys. Yeah, and the embryo within it. So if you look at this picture here, you can see that the embryo is folded into this really classic reptile egg position. We see this in birds as well today. We saw it in dinosaurs. We see that clearly in dinosaur fossil embryos. But yeah, it's gorgeous. It's sort of cute. It's wrapped up. It's got his little tail like wrapped around himself. It's got his long little face. So this fossil here, you can see, if you look at the top right, you can see a row of tiny triangular teeth on the very top. So that's the face, if you like. And you can see, the same artist's illustration there, which is really beautiful. So yeah, the Permian was when these hard-shelled eggs started to form, and these were eggs that could be deposited not in nests at first, probably just plopped into leaves or plopped into the ground, essentially planted just like we would plant a seed. That's how we think those early reptiles were doing it. So yeah, this kind of egg, this really sort of boring, some would say, I wouldn't, but boring structure, actually, has gone through various versions, like upgrades, if you like. And those upgrades are instilled in animals because of the planet, because of continents moving around, climates changing. Eggs are a product of that. So yeah, Love that. I think that's another really interesting thing. So in the reptiles, those early reptiles, we call that the amnio egg, which I'm sure some of you guys will know about, perhaps even learned about. This is a really important egg in the history of animals. It's basically an egg. So chickens have this kind of egg. It's an egg with loads of rooms in it. And each room is doing a different thing. You've got like a room for getting rid of waste. You've got a room for grabbing oxygen from the atmosphere. You've got a room filled with yolk, which is what the embryo uses to grow. So that's room kind of egg. That's a really important part of, the history of reptiles, and in a weird sort of way, the history of mammals as well. So my fourth interesting fact is, in the mammal group, if you think about those early reptiles, there are some animal groups which keep the eggs within their body. And that isn't just like a mammal thing. That isn't just a thing we see with dogs or cats or humans. It's also something that we see all over the place in nature. So this is not a uniquely mammal thing. Keeping your eggs in your body is not even weird. It's not even a weird mammal thing. It's all over the place. So the first evidence we see of it goes back 375 million years ago. This is a really early, simple sort of fish, and fossils of that fish show not just little tiny fish embryos within the adult fish. We also see fossils of like umbilical cords. So this is the cord that hooks you up to your mother, your birth mother. We see fossils of that umbilical cord in this really amazing early fish from ages ago. We also see this happening in real time. This is evolution happening in real time right now. This is a type of almost legless lizard that lives in Australia. It's called a skink, is a type of skink. And this is in the process of becoming more mammal-like, let's say. Those skinks that live at the bottom of this one mountain range in Australia, they lay eggs like many other lizards. But the lizards of the same species that live at the top of the mountain give birth, more like we do. So we see in colder places, mountaintops, for instance, we see like a selective pressure. In other words, we see animals starting to evolve to keep their eggs in the body, to keep them warm, to keep them protected from the outside. We see it in sharks as well, many, many different species of sharks, particularly those like great whites that move into colder waters. We see again that pattern, if you like, of keeping the eggs within the body, growing the embryos within the body. So that's what the story of mammals is kind of about. It's about keeping those eggs within the body and giving birth, if you like, to little babies without the need for eggshell. But of course, we aren't the only mammal group out there. So the early mammals we think were, laying eggs and giving milk to their babies, much like mammals do today. But the kind of cool thing about, well, I find the really cool thing about animal groups is when you have certain groups of animals get stuck somewhere, like they get stuck on an island, or they might get stuck on a massive, massive island like Australia, and you see them evolving down their own kind of path, if you like, that's different to the rest of the world. So this happened in the Triassic, in the very early age of dinosaurs. We saw some groups get sort of stuck on different continents and evolving their own unique tricks. And one of those tricks, of course, is marsupials. I can't get enough of marsupials. It is ridiculous to me that we live on a planet with a bunch of animals that have a pouch, that keep, their juvenile, their fairly youngish babies within a pouch. And this kangaroo you're looking at, of course, like all marsupials, can be pregnant with the next baby. So they can be nursing the next baby while looking after their teenager, like in a skin flap that we call a pouch. So I love these kind of these examples where you get to see evolution working on its own in a different part of the world. So Australia and even South America, before it was connected to North America, had its own collection of mammals doing their own egg laying, well, their own baby producing strategies. And we get to see that, as zoologists, we get to sort of play with the bones and look at the adaptations and sort of bodies of these animals and kind of how they all differ. And there is a tiny little offshoot as well, another sort of crazy mammal branch of the mammal family tree that I don't think we celebrate enough, and that is the platypus and its relatives, the echidna, the spiny anteater, they call it. And on the left, it looks a bit like feces. This is an example of a nest made by a platypus. In the middle, you can see two things. They look a bit like acorns. These are, of course, the eggs that platypus lay. They're about the size of like a chocolate egg. In Britain, we have like mini eggs. It's about that big, in other words. So it looks a bit like a mini egg to me, a mini chocolate egg. So yeah, this is a part of the mammal tribe, a part of the mammal group that split off from the rest of the mammals in the Triassic, in the earliest days of dinosaurs. And incredibly, no one's quite sure why or how these very, very small group of early mammals have persisted. They've stayed into the modern day, avoided trouble. They've managed not to go extinct, and we're lucky enough to share the world with them today. So this is an example, perhaps, of what those early Triassic mammals looked like. They went around laying their eggs in special nests. And these animals, I'm sure there are some of you that know this amazing fact, but these animals, platypus, they haven't even evolved like milk producing areas, let's say. But what they have evolved is milk producing armpits. So they basically express milk out of their armpits or kind of on their belly. And that's what their babies lap up. And their babies are called puggles, which is the coolest, most beautiful word I think I've ever heard said. So yeah, I'd say one of the most, again, on this journey of looking into eggs and egg strategies that I've been on, I'm still amazed and find the mammal story really, really, really beautiful. And the rise of mammals in the modern day, particularly the rise of mammals that keep their babies in their bodies for as long as possible, is another aspect of particularly human evolution that is totally crazy. So if you look at this, I mean, I'm just like, I'm right. I'm an adult. I write about evolution. I write about animal bodies, and even I'm like, oh my gosh, it's incredible, isn't it? Like, they were all plugged into our mums, and this all goes back to some sort of carboniferous animal story. But I find that really, really beautiful and amazing that our kind of reproductive strategies and our reproductive history, if you like, has been carved and chiseled millions of years ago, back in the animal kingdom, I suppose. So I really, really, really love that. So they are my 5 areas of egg science that I've really enjoyed learning about writing this book. I would love if you've got any questions or if there's any aspects of this area of evolution that you're interested in. I would honestly love to hear your stories or your questions. So if you have any questions or anything like that, please, yeah, Kenneth, take it away. Let's go. But yeah, thank you again for having me. It's been absolutely lovely.
All right. Thank you so much, Jules. And we do have a couple of comments and questions. And if anybody else who is attending it live, they can just type it in the chat box. I forgot, but I have 2 emu eggs at my house.
Oh wow, that is well, this is fantastic. Okay. So they look
Yeah.
quite dark to me. I thought they were a bit greener.
They come in lots of different shades. My friend had 2 female emus, and these are, hollowed out. You
Yeah,
can
lovely.
paint, he was going to paint on them, but then he gave them to us. Yeah.
No, they're great. I mean, that's one of the biggest. I'm not going to go on for too long about this, but one of the biggest sort of most interesting thing is how birds have never gone down a mammal line and kind of got rid of their eggs, or they've held on to their eggs for longer. But with emus and kiwis, these other kind of land walking birds, you do see the evolution of this larger egg, which is a pattern that we see in great white sharks, is a pattern, of course, we see in humans. Giving birth in a safe world, animals often evolve to kind of produce much bigger babies. So yeah, emu eggs. Oh, I'm really jealous.
I just visited a aquarium research center, and they talked about the 3 different ways that sharks can reproduce.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
All right. I don't know if you know this, but Richard Dawkins did help he founded TIES, the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science. And he said the chicken is only an egg's way for making another egg.
Yeah,
And
agree.
recently he had a conversation with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and Neil said that for the chicken versus egg debut, obviously it's the egg. It just wasn't laid by a chicken. And then Dawkins replies that there was never a moment where a bird that wasn't a chicken gave rise to a chicken, but philosophically we're compressing hundreds of millions of years. But yes, like you mentioned, the egg came first.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I do. One thing I'll say about that is that there is, like if you think about like the Romans, for instance, the Greeks loved the chicken and the egg thing. For them, that was like a real brain teaser. But I think there is still plenty of mileage to be had about that. Like at what point is a chicken a chicken? Well, it could also be when it's been named by people. So when you have that exact genetic combination of, the precursor to mother chicken, precursor to father chicken, producing an egg within which is the exact genetic structure of the thing that we go, oh, that's a chicken. Is that the first chicken? I don't know, but I do. Yeah, I really love that. I really love it.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about these small little genetic changes over time.
Mm,
And you're right. Even if you think about dog breeds,
mm,
we're like, well, this we're going to call, we're going to categorize it this way.
mm.
But if it has curly fur, we're going to call it something completely
Agreed.
different. All right. You're a zoologist or a zoology correspondent, and this book covers a lot of different types of animals. What did your research look like, as you can't possibly be an expert initially in all of these different taxa?
Yeah, do I've never been asked that question, but I honestly think it's one of the most important questions to ask. This book, my previous books have focused on one thing, so it might be the evolution of dog brains, dog cognition, or it might be the evolution of how a certain group of animals reproduce. This one was a real challenge, so I had to approach it chronologically and look at the periods. So to go like the Cambrian period, life's first starting here, what kinds of animals were there, and then from that go to the museums and essentially look at the fossils, but also find experts in each topic and say like, oh, can you tell me a bit more about how that weird crustacean from the Cambrian period,
Mhm.
how it reproduced, or what does this fossil really tell us about whether that's diagnostic of the whole prehistoric group, so to speak. So yeah, basically it was like going into about 100 different libraries and finding experts who could help me tell the story, I guess.
All right, this comment came up when you're talking about the platypus, and they write, manatees and elephants also nurse under their armpits.
Okay. Oh, I love the manatee one as well. That's a really good shout. Okay, I'm going to make a note of that. That's going into the next talk I do. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
So manatees and their close relatives, elephants, also have their mammary glands under their armpits. Not sure about hyrexes.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to know, wouldn't it?
I'm glad you mentioned how you can see evolution happening in real time when you were talking about the legless
Hmm.
lizards, because there's lots of examples of this, including antibiotic resistance and animals adapting or not adapting to climate change.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in fact, the end of the book, the epilogue is looking at how animals within our lifetime are adapting to climate change. Particularly, things like spiders, for instance, in some parts of Alaska, evolving to produce two batches of eggs in a season because, of course, there's warmer, there's more warmth, there's more insect activity, there's more prey. So yeah, this is something that we're going to see change in our lifetime. As you say, we are already seeing that evolutionary change occur, which is really interesting.
You can also think about people breeding a weed from the Mediterranean, like wild mustard, into Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kohlrabi, kale, all the different types of kale. That
Mm.
happened in recent in our recent past.
Yeah, yeah. And the other thing that I mean, we I wish we could see it. I wish we could get in a time machine and see it. But if it's sort of inevitable, if you like, that eggs will become tougher, and it's inevitable, I guess, that fish were going to move out, onto the land and start moving, and exploring the land as a potential ecosystem. And in fact, there are many fish today that you can see their evolution to land, to dry areas, whether it's cave walls or whether it's mud skippers in mangroves. I love the fact we can see some of those processes that we can only imagine happened in the past. We can still see them happening today. In the UK, one of the things I used to much more, but used to visit schools and talk about evolution like you guys do. And I was always struck by sometimes people would be like, "What? A fish walking on the land? That's crazy." But it's kind of like, no, actually, these sort of evolutionary expressions are inevitable and they're happening all the time, out there even today.
I'm in Tampa, Florida, and we have invasive walking catfish.
Of course. Yeah, yeah. So would you ever see them? Like, like if you just went down to like a creek, would you be lucky enough to
Yes,
see them? You would.
yes,
And are they
yes.
moving between like ponds or are they moving to just find new habitat?
Yeah, you can just see them walking down a dirt road looking for the next body of water.
Oh, wow,
They're
amazing.
maybe a foot to 2 feet long.
Wow.
So they're
Okay.
big.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Wow, amazing.
You showed us tiny eggs from stick insects all the way up to emu eggs. What egg do you think is the most beautiful?
Oh, it's such a good one. It's such a good one. I do, I showed you shield bug eggs. They were the ones that looked like I said they were sort of reminding me of sci-fi sort of astronauts. Those are pretty beautiful eggs. Do you know, I'm going to go right back to frog spawn. I just think accessible. You can see what's going on there. They're like in their own little glass-proof surroundings. You can properly peer in and see what's going on. So yeah, for me, it's definitely always going to be frog spawn. Great question. Thank you.
Many years ago, I worked at an aquarium, and the axolotls
Mm.
would have hundreds of eggs at a time, and they're an amphibian, so you can also see them gestate within the egg. And if you are a school teacher, an axolotl makes a great classroom pet.
At the start I said about frog spawn in classrooms. Do you have that in the US?
Yeah, in elementary school, you can get like bullfrog. I don't know if you can get the eggs, but you can definitely get the tadpole.
Yeah, interesting.
I mean,
Cool.
I'm supposing, or depending on where you are, you can probably find some in a creek and add them to a classroom tank.
Cool.
And then, okay, I think this is the last question, unless anybody else wants to type something into the chat. What advice do you have for a young person interested in writing about animals or nature for a living?
I would say start now, and it doesn't mean you have to publish anything. You don't have to show anyone. But I have a bit of a regret, and it's like I honestly thought like writing something that only certain people get to do. Okay, so the people who are good at English, for instance, who are like, "Oh, I love stories, I love reading, I love writing stories." I just was like, "Oh, I wasn't really like that, when I was younger," and I was like, "Oh, that's not an accessible route for me." And it was only about when I was 25, someone said, "Oh, mate, you can actually write," and I was like, "Oh, that's interesting." I had no idea. So I would say, yeah, start now, write about everything you can, write about what interests you. The first thing in the morning when you wake up and that, oh wow, I love that animal or whatever it is pops into your head, that's an opportunity to write. But it's a bit like a muscle, right? It's like being an athlete in its own way. It's like, you have to carry on doing it and just make it always do it for fun, I suppose. And it's amazing that I really love it's going to sound crazy, but I love who's the guy who wrote Hamilton? I've forgotten his name.
Yes,
Help,
of
help
course.
me out. Yeah, anyway, his name's escaped me. This is terrible. My kids are going to hate me for this. But a lot of the stuff that he refers to, the music that is coming out in Hamilton and musicals, is stuff that he was writing, on his own when he was 14. Some of those musical ditties, 14, 15, he was writing those. And it's the same with writing about animals. It's the same with writing about science. Some of the things that you express, you writing out when you're like even you're 10 or 11 or whatever it might be, you can still use those later in life. So it's like learning these skills that you can flex later on in life. So yeah, go for it. Absolutely. What a brilliant time of life to really get stuck in there. So excellent.
Very good. Joshua and Mary and many others would like to say Lin-Manuel Miranda.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, of course. Oh, slap on the hand.
We will be sure to tag Lin-Manuel Miranda to see if you would like to fund a future webinar. All right.
Brilliant.
Yes, thank you everyone for attending this live, and thank you, Jules, for the excellent conversation about eggs. And we look forward to everyone attending future TIES webinars.
Cool. Thank you ever
you,
so much
Jules.
for having me. Thank you, guys. Good luck. Brilliant. Thank you.